Begin tonight with the escalating fight between the Trump administration and Congress. Attorney General Bill Barr, a no-show today at a House Judiciary hearing, with Democrats considering holding him in contempt and Speaker Pelosi accusing him of a crime.
What is deadly serious about it is the Attorney General of the United States of America was not telling the truth to the Congress of the United States. That's a crime. He lied to Congress. If anybody else did that, it would be considered a crime. Nobody is above the law, not the President of the United States and not the Attorney General.
So that is huge. The Speaker of the House accusing the Attorney General of committing a crime for lying to Congress today in the empty chair where Barr was supposed to sit, refusing to come in because Democrats wanted committee staffers to question him. Democrats calling him too scared to even face them, with one bringing in a bucket of KFC chicken. That's interesting. To make the point, Chairman Nadler saying they're going to work for a few more days to get Barr to turn over the full unredacted Mueller report. And if he does not, they're going to vote to hold him in contempt. Listen to this.
We will have no choice but to move quickly to hold the Attorney General in contempt if he stalls or fails to negotiate in good faith. If he does not provide this committee with the information it demands and the respect it deserves, Mr. Barr's moment of accountability will come soon enough.
Also today, Trump's White House counsel blasting Mueller in a letter revealed today, complaining to Barr that the Mueller report was, quote, political. One person who has not responded to that yet or any of the other news, Bob Mueller. But Democrats say they want him to have him testify on May 15th. With me now, Maya Wiley, former counsel to the mayor of New York City and a civil prosecutor for the Southern District of New York, and author Jonathan Alter, who's now a columnist at the Daily Beast and MSNBC political analyst. I want to start with the moment that Nancy Pelosi is talking about now, accusing the Attorney General of a crime. And that was the moment. Let's go to that soundbite, you guys. Let's play that, and then we'll have Maya first respond to it.
Reports have emerged recently, General, that members of the special counsel's team are frustrated at some level with the limited information included in your March 24th letter, that it does not adequately or accurately necessarily portray the report's findings. Do you know what they're referencing with that?
No, I don't.
The question was relating to unidentified members who were expressing frustration over the accuracy relating to findings. I don't know what that refers to at all. I talked directly to Bob Mueller, not members of his team.
So you have House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Maya, saying that was a crime, that he perjured himself right there in his testimony, because he said that he did not know of any sort of things from Mueller's team and how they felt about his findings and his report that he put out there, the Mueller memo, the 4-page Mueller memo. And then he was trying to explain himself there and saying he spoke to Bob Mueller himself, not Mueller's team. Let me point out, Bob Mueller is the head of his team. The definition of a team is the leader along with the people that are working underneath him. So is this a crime?
It is potentially a crime. And when I say potentially, what I mean is Nancy Pelosi is completely within her rights in this instance to say, this is a lie in my book, and I believe it should be potentially prosecuted. Whether it will win a jury is a different question. That's why I say potential, because what William Barr has done, he's a very clever lawyer, right? He's parsing here. This is like, remember the Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky defense? I wasn't lying, and because it wasn't intercourse. This is that kind of defense. And so
he knew exactly what he was doing.
He understood it is hard to believe that he did not understand the question, and it is hard to believe that he did not understand Bob Mueller calling him the day after his summary saying, hey, sending him a letter saying, hey, wait a minute, and then having a conversation with him by phone saying, hey, wait a minute, that he did not understand that to be related to the concerns that were being voiced in the press from members of Mueller's team. That's what you have to believe that he was not lying. But a jury technically might find that not a lie, but I think what's so concerning here is a sitting U.S. Attorney General should have been forthcoming in answering that question to say, I don't know, but I have had a communication with Mueller suggesting that he had concerns. That would have been the appropriate thing to do for a sitting U.S. Attorney General who's addressing Congress, which has oversight authority over the agency.
So you have Maya Wiley saying this is a crime. You have the House Speaker saying this is a crime, Jonathan. So what is to be done about it? How significant is it that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi went on the record and called this a crime? She's got to follow through with something on
No,
this.
I don't think she actually does on that. Look, she's laying down a marker that his testimony, not just in this instance, but it was a festival of lies. At best, it was ridiculous hair splitting or, mansplaining, bar-splaining to the committee in ways that were very misleading. But it's highly unlikely that they're going to bring a perjury charge against the Attorney General. What's much more likely is that they're going to hold him in contempt for not turning over the unredacted version of the Mueller report and for not agreeing to testify. The latter is especially outrageous. Congress has constitutional and legal authority for oversight of the executive branch. They can, and in this case, they will compel him to appear on Capitol Hill. They're probably going to have to go to court to do it, but he will end up testifying because the law is totally 100% on the side of Congress. Now, in the past, what's happened is that witnesses have been able to negotiate over the timing of their testimony. They say, I can't come in next Tuesday, but I'll come in a week from Wednesday.
This is different, though, it seems.
That's considered acceptable. But there is no precedent for saying, well, I'm not going to come in and testify if you have because I'm scared of you appointing the counsel, like a Sam Dash or John Doerr character from Watergate, who is not a member of Congress, but a professional to do the questioning. That's what he's afraid of because he knows he did badly in front of the Senate. He's on very thin ice, and he doesn't want a professional instead of a grandstanding politician to be questioning him. But that is not grounds for him to refuse to testify. So this eventually he will be compelled to testify.
So you have Chairman Nadler saying we want to negotiate over the next 2 days before he decides what he's going to do next. Obviously, that is not only about releasing the Mueller report in full without redactions, that is also about having the Attorney General appear before them in testimony and provide testimony.
That's the key issue right now.
That is the key issue right now. If the Attorney General, Maya, is found in contempt, that is an incredibly long process. The question is it worth it?
It can be a long process. We've been referring to the Fast and Furious when Eric Holder was held in contempt, and that has
went all the way until Trump became president.
Went all the way. Although one of the things that's important to note there is the D.C. courts actually said, no, you don't have executive privilege to the Obama administration in a case where I would argue if they didn't have it in that case, there's no way the Trump administration can assert it credibly. But the point is, I think there's the issue of the institutional credibility and constitutional authority of the Congress, and then there's how to prioritize getting this story out to the American public, because one of the things that Barr is doing is obfuscating. He's making the picture opaque. He's misrepresenting things that are in the report. He's misrepresenting the law in some instances.
Well, and honestly, it just seems like as simply as this, he doesn't care.
Well, I think he cares very much about spinning the narrative, and he's been willing to do it in a way that is misrepresenting both Mueller's report and even his communications with Robert Mueller about Robert Mueller's belief that he's misrepresenting the report. And I think what's critical here is then getting Robert Mueller to come and say what is inconsistent,
That's critical.
what his concerns are.
That's the most important thing. We got to hear from Bob Mueller.
Mueller is the main act, and we've read the book, or some people have read the book. Now we need to see the movie. We need to show the movie of Donald Trump's crimes to the American people, and that is done through congressional testimony, getting Don McGahn in there, and the other key witnesses
Bob Mueller
in this case. And Mueller's a very important.
So we've been speaking about contempt here. Before I bring in my next guest, I want to run through the options Congress has if they hold someone in contempt. So Congress could do one of three things after the vote: try to get House security to arrest Barr, But that hasn't happened since the 1930s. They could refer the case to a federal prosecutor in Washington, D.C., but every federal prosecutor in the U.S. works for the Attorney General, so that's probably a non-starter as well. Or they could ask a judge to issue a civil citation, and there is precedent for that, as we were just talking about. But the legal fights, they took years on that one. When Democrats held Bush White House counsel Harriet Miers in contempt, the fight lasted until Obama took office. And then what we were just talking about when Republicans held Eric Holder in contempt, the case was still going on when Trump took office. So it takes a very long time. I want to bring in Maryland Congressman Jamie Raskin, who serves on the Judiciary Committee and was waiting for Attorney General Barr at the hearing this morning. Take me into the room this morning, Congressman, first and foremost, as you were awaiting Attorney General Barr and full well knowing he was not going to show up.
Well, it was a disappointing thing because we had watched the exchanges in the Senate when we could intermittently yesterday. And it's clear that Attorney General Barr has been exposed as a propagandist and self-appointed consigliere for Donald Trump at this point. When he received the report from the special counsel Mueller, it was pretty much ready to go. He could have gotten it ready and given it to us in 24 hours or 48 hours, which was pretty much the historical standard with prior special counsels and independent counsels. Instead, he began this three and a half week period of propaganda in which he tried to create an impression about what was in there, a false impression about what was in the report, and then to cement it in the public mind. And we are still trying to lift this thick fog of propaganda by bringing in witnesses, and they're trying to resist us and obstruct us on that. And we are trying to get the unredacted report as well as all of the underlying materials that go with it. And we expect that. And if not, we definitely plan to find the Attorney General in contempt. And understand, we don't have to go to court to start this off, and we don't have to get him arrested to start it off. We can find him in contempt in committee. If you act with contempt for Congress and our lawful powers, we will find you in contempt of Congress and the rule of law. From the Judiciary Committee, it then goes to the House floor, in which case the House would vote as to whether or not he's in contempt. Everything that you mentioned was the question of enforcement.
So here's the big question for you, Congressman. Here's the big question for you. What is that going to accomplish, finding the Attorney General in contempt? What are you looking to accomplish there with that?
Well, look, what we have is an administration that is now engulfed in lawlessness and corruption, and we have to begin to check them at important points. The Attorney General theoretically should be on our side, but is not. He obviously has gone over to the side of the president and is cooperating in promoting the president's position now, which is that he will not cooperate with any subpoenas. He will not respond to any lawful orders or requests from the House of Representatives. That's obviously constitutionally intolerable, and Congress can't put up with it. So we have to make clear to the public and make clear to the whole system of government that the Attorney General is acting outside of the law. Then we have to proceed to get to the guts of the Mueller report, to bring those witnesses forward so America can hear.
Absolutely.
And
you're bringing up a really good point here, because one of the, I think, directives here and the big questions here is, do we pursue the Attorney General until he provides testimony for the House? Or do we pursue the unredacted Mueller report along with testimony from Bob Mueller? Is that where we put our energy?
Yeah, well, I think that's where the focus has got to be. That's what we were going after. We're trying to determine whether or not the president committed obstruction of justice. There were 10 episodes of presidential obstruction or attempted obstruction, which were recounted by special counsel Mueller in the report. Obviously, the Attorney General did everything he could to pull the wool over everyone's eyes and to obscure that fact, and he pronounced himself basically the judge, the jury, the executioner, the Congress, and said there was no obstruction of justice. Obviously, we're disregarding that propaganda ploy by the AG. Instead, we're going after what is actually in the report. We want critical witnesses to come forward and testify to our committee, including Don McGahn, the White House counsel who was ordered by the president to fire special counsel Mueller through Rod Rosenstein. We want to hear from him exactly what happened. We want the American people to hear what happened so we can get some semblance of reality. Really what we're after is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth here. And then we're going to decide what to do.
All right, Congressman Jamie Raskin, Jonathan Alter, you have a final word, Jonathan?
Well, I was just going to say that Congressman
I'm getting yelled
Raskin
at right now, so say it quick.
said, you know, we want him on our side. He didn't mean on the side of the Democrats. What he meant is on the side of the law. He's
the law.
Barr is the chief law enforcement officer of the United States. Oversight is in a book. It's the law. And
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.